When Ivan Volkov plastered another layer of river clay onto what neighbors called his bread oven monstrosity, the homesteaders along the Yenisei River laughed behind cupped hands. They didn't know he was building a heating system that would burn one log every 24 hours, while their cast-iron stoves devoured entire cords of birch weekly. By February 1891, when temperatures dropped to minus 48 degrees Fahrenheit and his neighbors' cabins turned into frozen tombs, despite roaring fires, Volkov's family slept in shirt sleeves. If you want to discover more incredible stories of innovation in extreme conditions, subscribe to our channel and join thousands of history enthusiasts uncovering the engineering secrets that changed survival on the frontier. The winter of 1890 brought an unprecedented wave of settlers to the Krasnoyarsk region of Siberia. The Trans-Siberian Railway construction camps needed workers. The government offered land grants of 160 acres to any family willing to clear land and establish permanent residence. Timber companies promised wages of 12 rubles per month for experienced loggers, 8 rubles for laborers. Within 6 months, over 2,000 families established homesteads in a region where winter temperatures regularly fell below minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there for 5 months straight. They came from everywhere: Ukrainians fleeing land shortages, Poles seeking escape from political turmoil, Germans looking for agricultural opportunities, Russians from the crowded western provinces, even a handful of Scandinavian families attracted by promises of timber wealth. The diversity created a linguistic chaos where Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, German, Swedish, and Finnish mixed in the trading posts and construction camps. But one document unified them all: the official Homesteader's Manual. The manual, distributed by the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and translated into a dozen languages for immigrant settlers, dedicated 17 pages to proper cabin heating. It was not a casual recommendation, but an engineered specification developed by the Imperial Technical Institute in St. Petersburg, based on studies conducted in Moscow, Arkhangelsk, and other northern cities where winter heating had been scientifically analyzed. The recommendations were absolute and detailed. Construct a cabin with walls at least 8 inches thick using local pine logs, each log to be at least 7 inches in diameter at the small end, chinked with moss mixed with clay in a ratio of 3 parts. Moss to 1 part clay, applied in layers not exceeding 1 inch thickness to prevent cracking. Install a cast-iron stove manufactured in St. Petersburg or imported from Sweden, specifically models approved by the Imperial Foundry Commission, which had tested various designs for thermal output, durability, and safety. Position the stove centrally with a brick base 18 to 24 inches high, maintaining clearance of at least 36 inches from wooden walls to prevent fire hazard. Maintain a chimney height of at least 12 feet measured from the stove top, constructed of fired brick mortared with lime cement, with interior dimensions of 8 inches by 8 inches to ensure adequate draft. Keep a minimum supply of 6 cords of firewood per winter month, calculated based on an assumed average temperature of minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, an assumed burn rate of 10 pounds per hour, and an assumed heating season of 150 days. These instructions came from experienced engineers, men who had surveyed the region during summer expeditions, calculated heat loss coefficients based on wall thickness and air infiltration rates, and designed systems proven in Moscow's winters, where temperatures rarely fell below minus 25 degrees for extended periods. The manual included 43 detailed diagrams showing proper log placement, chinking techniques, stove installation angles, chimney construction sequences, and firewood stacking methods to prevent moisture absorption. It included materials lists specifying quantities down to the number of bricks and pounds of mortar. It included cost estimates averaging 78 rubles for a complete heating system installation. Every settler received a copy upon registering their land claim at the district office in Krasnoyarsk. Every timber merchant stocked the approved cast-iron stoves, Heavy units weighing between 200 and 300 pounds, with walls 3/8 of an inch thick, forged from high-grade iron, smelted in the Ural foundries, with fireboxes capable of holding logs up to 20 inches long and 12 inches in diameter. The Swedish models, imported through St. Petersburg and shipped east on the new railway, cost 47 rubles and featured superior casting quality, smoother interior surfaces that reduced creosote buildup, and adjustable draft controls that theoretically allowed for fuel efficiency optimization. The Russian models, manufactured in foundries near Yekaterinburg, cost 32 rubles and offered simpler construction, heavier gauge iron that proponents claimed would last longer despite less refined finish, and larger firebox volumes that accommodated the irregular split wood most settlers produced. Installation required another 8 rubles for the brick foundation materials and chimney construction, plus 3 to 5 rubles for a mason's labor if the settler lacked masonry skills. The total investment for a heating system ranged from 43 rubles for the most economical setup to 62 rubles for premium equipment with professional installation. The logic seemed unassailable. The engineers who wrote the manual understood thermodynamics. They knew that cast iron conducted heat rapidly, with thermal conductivity 40 times greater than wood, 20 times greater than brick, allowing heat to radiate from the stove's surface quickly and efficiently, spreading warmth throughout the cabin. They knew that the thick log walls of the cabin, with their low thermal conductivity, would trap that heat inside, creating an insulated envelope that minimized heat loss to the exterior environment. They had calculated the surface area of a typical cast iron stove, approximately 12 to 15 square feet, and estimated radiant heat output at various surface temperatures, projecting that a stove maintaining 200 degrees Fahrenheit surface temperature would deliver sufficient heat to maintain a cabin interior at 60 degrees Fahrenheit when exterior temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees. Their mathematics was sound. Their materials were proven. Their logic followed established principles of heat transfer and building science, as understood in 1890. The wealthier settlers, those with capital from previous ventures or family support, bought the Swedish stoves, trusting in European manufacturing superiority and the promise of adjustable efficiency. The poorer settlers, those who had scraped together barely enough for land and basic supplies, bought the Russian models, accepting the lower cost even if it meant slightly inferior performance. A handful of the poorest settlers built their own stoves from scavenged materials, welding together iron plates and pipes. But even these improvised devices followed the same basic principle: metal firebox, central placement, direct radiant heating. Everyone followed the manual. By October, when the first hard freeze arrived on the night of October 7th, bringing temperatures down to 18 degrees Fahrenheit and covering the ground with 4 inches of snow, over 800 cabins stood ready, each one heated exactly as the experts recommended, each one about to discover that sometimes expertise fails when it encounters conditions beyond its experience. John Crawford, a Scottish timber contractor who built his cabin 300 yards from what would become Volkov's homestead, followed every specification precisely. His cabin measured 20 feet by 16 feet with walls constructed from local pine logs, each log averaging 9 inches in diameter, carefully chinked with moss and clay. He installed a Russian-manufactured cast-iron stove on a brick base 18 inches high, centered in the main room exactly as the manual specified. The stove stood 34 inches tall with a firebox measuring 14 inches wide by 18 inches deep. The chimney rose 13 feet from the stovetop, constructed of mortared brick. Crawford spent 63 rubles on materials and 3 weeks of labor. When he lit the first fire on October 18th, the stove glowed red-hot within 20 minutes. The cabin's interior temperature, which had been 38 degrees Fahrenheit, rose to 56 degrees within the first hour. Crawford added more wood. By evening, with the fire roaring, the temperature near the stove reached 72 degrees Fahrenheit. He fell asleep, confident in his investment. He woke at 3 in the morning shivering. The fire had consumed all the wood and died. The cabin temperature had dropped to 41 degrees. The cast iron, which had blazed with heat 6 hours earlier, now felt cool to the touch. Crawford relit the fire, burning through another armload of birch. By dawn, he had consumed approximately 40 pounds of firewood. Over the next week, he established a pattern. Load the stove every 4 hours, day and night, burning through roughly 120 pounds of wood per day to maintain barely adequate temperatures. Other settlers reported identical experiences. The cast-iron stoves were hungry, insatiable machines that turned cord after cord of precious firewood into heat that seemed to vanish into the air. By November, Crawford had burned through 2 full cords, 1,600 pounds of birch, and the coldest months hadn't even begun. His hands developed cracks from constant wood splitting. His sleep came in 4-hour fragments between firewood runs. The cabin's interior, despite the continuous burning, never felt genuinely warm except in a small radius immediately surrounding the stove. The corners stayed cold. Frost formed on the interior walls during the deepest nights. His wife developed a persistent cough from the temperature fluctuations and the constant smoke that leaked back into the room whenever wind gusts overwhelmed the chimney draft. When Crawford complained to the timber company supervisor, the man shrugged and showed him the manual. Everything was built correctly. This was simply the reality of Siberian winter. Burn more wood. Stack it higher. Split it finer. Keep the fire roaring. Ivan Volkov arrived in the region with a different history carved into his bones. Born in 1856 in a village near Pskov, the third son of a minor landowner who lost everything to debts and vodka, he grew up in a stone cottage heated by a massive Russian stove built by his grandfather, a master mason who had learned the craft from men who had learned it from their grandfathers, a chain of knowledge stretching back centuries before anyone thought to write it in manuals. That stove, built from river clay and river stones, weighed over 3 tons and occupied nearly a quarter of their cottage's footprint, dominating the central room like an altar to heat itself. It had sleeping platforms on top where the family slept during the coldest nights, its mass radiating steady warmth for hours after the fire died, creating a microclimate where even in January, when exterior temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Fahrenheit, the platform's surface maintained temperatures around 85 degrees, warm enough that Volkov's mother dried clothes there and his grandmother proofed bread dough in wooden bowls set on the warm surface. Volkov's grandfather fed that stove once daily, always in the evening after supper, burning perhaps 30 pounds of wood, a mixture of birch for heat and aspen for flame, building a fire that burned hot and fast, sending smoke through channels that Volkov could only imagine but never see, hidden within the clay mass. The fire burned for 2 to 3 hours, filling the cottage with flickering light and the smell of burning wood, then settled into coals that glowed orange through the night. His grandfather never let the fire smolder. He burned it hot, completely, then closed the damper and let the mass do its work. The cottage stayed warm through the entire night and well into the next afternoon. On the coldest days, his grandfather lit a second fire at dawn, but those days were rare. The stove's capacity seemed almost magical to young Volkov, this enormous clay structure that asked so little and gave so much. As a child, Volkov watched his grandfather mix the clay, a process that took days of preparation. The old man walked to the river in early autumn when water levels dropped, digging clay from specific locations where the bank showed a particular gray-brown color, avoiding the sandy deposits and the rocky areas, seeking clay that had the right consistency, neither too sticky nor too crumbly. He carried it back in sacks, maybe 40 sacks over the course of a week, piling it near the construction site. Then came the mixing, the old man's hands working the clay with water, kneading it like bread dough, adding chopped straw cut to lengths of 2 to 3 inches. mixing until the consistency satisfied some standard that existed only in his practiced hands. Volkov asked why the straw. His grandfather explained that clay shrinks when it dries, cracks if the walls are too thick, but straw holds it together, gives it strength, prevents cracking, like bones in a body. The old man selected stones from the river, flat river stones worn smooth by current, rejecting any stone that showed cracks or weathering that might cause it to break when heated. He worked for 3 months to build that stove, working in the cottage during the day while Volkov's father worked the remaining family land, shaping the interior channels with careful precision. Using wooden templates, he carved himself to ensure the passages maintained proper dimensions. The construction process seemed almost ritualistic. The old man built in layers, never more than 8 inches per day, letting each layer partially dry before adding the next, preventing the structure from slumping under its own weight. He built the firebox first, lining it with the flattest stones, setting them in clay mortar, creating a chamber that could withstand direct flame. Then he built the first channel, a rising passage that took smoke upward from the firebox into a chamber above, where the smoke would hit the stove's top surface and be forced to descend through side channels. He explained to Volkov, who was perhaps 9 or 10 years old, that smoke wants to rise. That's its nature. Hot smoke rises. But if you make it go down, if you force it through channels, it gives its heat to the clay as it travels. It can't help but give its heat. That's how you steal the heat from the smoke before it escapes to the sky. Volkov remembered those words decades later. Steal the heat from the smoke. The engineers in their manuals talked about efficiency, about thermal conductivity, about BTUs and surface area, but his grandfather talked about stealing heat from smoke, and somehow that language captured the essential principle more clearly than any equation. The stove was not a heat generator. It was a heat thief, a device for stealing thermal energy from combustion gases and hiding it in clay mass, where it would release slowly, patiently, through the night and into the next day. At 16, Volkov left to work on a merchant ship in the Baltic trade, sailing between St. Petersburg and Stockholm, carrying timber and flax out, bringing manufactured goods back, spending winters in port cities where he saw how merchants lived, how engineers talked, how the modern world dismissed anything that couldn't be calculated with instruments. At 22, he joined a railroad construction crew in the Caucasus, working on the line between Baku and Batum, living in construction camps where workers slept in long wooden barracks heated by iron stoves that burned constantly and still left men shivering. He watched those stoves devour wood, watched the woodpile shrink daily, watched the bookkeeper calculate costs, and he thought about his grandfather's stove that burned once daily and kept a cottage warm. He tried to explain it once to an engineer, a man from Moscow with drawings and calculations, but the engineer smiled politely and spoke about modern methods, about tested systems, about progress. At 30, Volkov worked in the Donbas coal mines, descending each day into tunnels that somehow stayed warmer than the surface, learning that Earth itself holds temperature, that the deeper you go, the more stable the temperature becomes, understanding for the first time that his grandfather's foundation, that deep pit filled with stone, connected the stove to the Earth's thermal mass, creating stability. The coal mines had better heating systems than the railroad camps, using the mine's own waste coal in crude but massive brick furnaces that burned constantly but efficiently, their mass absorbing and releasing heat over many hours. The principle was there, visible to anyone who looked. Mass stores heat. Mass releases. Heat slowly. Mass creates duration. But the engineers still preferred cast iron for its quickness, its intensity, its apparent efficiency. When Volkov decided to take a homestead grant in Siberia, drawn by the promise of land and the adventure of frontier life, he knew exactly what he would build, and he knew exactly how his neighbors would react. He arrived in August 1890 with his wife Katerina, a school teacher from Pskov, who had agreed to marry him despite his lack of prospects, his reputation for strange ideas, his 44 rubles in savings that should have been more. He claimed a 160-acre plot near the Yenisei River, land covered with pine and birch, with a small creek running through the southwest corner, with river clay deposits visible where spring flooding had eroded the bank. He spent 3 weeks cutting logs for the cabin, working alone because he couldn't afford hired labor, skidding logs with a borrowed horse, raising walls that were modest but adequate, 20 feet by 14 feet, smaller than many of his neighbors but large enough for 2 people and the stove he planned to build. When he went to the district trading post and purchased only 1 bag of nails, no cast-iron stove, and spent his remaining money instead on shovels, wheelbarrows, trowels, wooden buckets, and a curious curved tool for smoothing clay, Crawford was there and asked him directly if he understood winter was coming, if he knew what he was doing, if he had read the manual. Volkov nodded and said he had a different plan, an old plan, a plan his grandfather taught him. Crawford, trying to be helpful, trying to save this strange Russian from his own ignorance, explained that the manual came from engineers in St. Petersburg, men who understood heating, men who had studied the problem scientifically. Volkov thanked him for the concern and continued loading his purchases onto his small wagon. When he began constructing something that looked more like a small clay hill than a stove, working in the corner of his cabin that received the most interior wall exposure, Crawford's wife Margaret told her friends at the Sunday gathering that the Russian man had lost his senses, that his wife must be a saint to tolerate such foolishness, that they would freeze by December and probably come begging for shelter. The other settlers watched with mixed curiosity and pity as Volkov excavated his foundation pit, as he hauled load after load of river clay in his wheelbarrow, as he shaped the structure slowly, layer by patient layer, working every day from dawn until dark, his hands covered in clay, his back bent from the labor of lifting and placing stones. The thing grew slowly over 4 weeks in September and October, a bizarre mound of river clay and river stones that seemed to consume the cabin's interior space, leaving barely enough room for a table and 2 sleeping pallets. It looked primitive, inefficient, wasteful. It looked like something a peasant from the Dark Ages might build, not something a rational settler in 1890 would waste time on. The structure Volkov built defied every specification in the official manual, yet it followed principles older than any government engineer's education, principles that would prove themselves when winter arrived in earnest. The structure Volkov built defied every specification in the official manual, yet it followed principles older than any government engineer's education. He began by excavating a foundation pit 3 feet deep and 8 feet square in the southwest corner of his cabin, the corner that would receive the most interior wall exposure and therefore radiate heat most effectively into the living space. The excavation took 2 days of hard labor with shovel and pickaxe, working through topsoil and then clay subsoil, finally hitting gravel at 34 inches depth. He didn't stop there. He continued to 40 inches, ensuring the foundation would rest below the frost line, preventing any settling or shifting during spring thaw. The pit filled with water overnight from groundwater seepage, which Volkov bailed out with buckets before beginning to fill the foundation. He filled the pit with carefully selected stone, river cobbles ranging from fist-sized to melon-sized, placing them by hand rather than dumping them randomly, fitting them together like a puzzle to minimize voids, creating a dense mass. Between the stones, he poured wet gravel mixed with coarse sand, working it into the gaps with a wooden rod, ensuring complete contact between stones, eliminating air pockets that could create thermal breaks. This foundation layer weighed approximately 1,800 pounds and served multiple purposes. It distributed the enormous weight of the stove across a wide area, preventing the cabin floor from sagging. It created thermal mass in contact with the earth itself, a heat sink that would moderate temperature swings, absorbing excess heat during the fire's burn and releasing it slowly when the stove's upper mass cooled. It also prevented moisture from wicking upward into the clay structure, which could cause deterioration over years of heating and cooling cycles. On this foundation, he built upward using river clay mixed with sand and chopped straw, in proportions that he measured by eye and feel rather than by written formula. Approximately 2 parts, clay to 1 part, sand to 1/4 part, straw by volume, though the exact ratio varied slightly depending on the clay's moisture content and consistency. The sand came from the creek bed, where water action had sorted particles to relatively uniform size, creating aggregate that would strengthen the clay matrix without creating weak spots. The straw came from wild grass that grew along the riverbank, which Volkov cut in September, dried for 2 weeks, then chopped to lengths between 2 and 4 inches using a hatchet and wooden block. The chopping pattern mattered. Too short, and the straw provided inadequate reinforcement. Too long, and the pieces would create preferential pathways for cracks to propagate. His grandfather had taught him to cut lengths roughly equal to the thickness of his thumb, a measurement that varied by person but somehow always produced the right proportion. The mixing process required physical labor and time. Volkov spread clay in layers about 4 inches thick on a wooden platform made from split logs, wetted it with river water carried in buckets, then walked on it barefoot, his feet kneading the clay, his weight forcing water into the clay's structure, breaking down clumps, creating uniform consistency. He added sand gradually, mixing it in with his feet, feeling the change in texture as the mixture became less sticky, more workable. Finally, he added the straw, incorporating it evenly throughout the mixture, ensuring no clumps of straw or pockets of pure clay remained. Each batch took approximately 45 minutes to prepare and yielded enough material for about 6 inches of vertical wall construction. He needed approximately 70 batches over the course of 4 weeks to complete the structure, meaning he spent over 50 hours just mixing clay, not counting the time required to harvest materials or the actual construction work. The structure's footprint measured 7 feet by 6 feet where it met the foundation, then tapered slightly as it rose, creating walls that were vertical on the interior surfaces where they would radiate heat into the room, but slightly sloped on the exterior surfaces where they met the cabin's log walls, improving stability and creating better thermal contact with the surrounding structure. The walls measured 18 inches thick at the base, tapering to 16 inches thick at the top, dimensions that Volkov determined based on memory of his grandfather's work and understanding of how far heat needed to travel through clay to create sustained release without excessive surface temperature. Too thin and the heat would release too quickly, requiring multiple fires per day. Too thick and the heat would never reach the outer surface, wasting thermal storage capacity. 18 inches represented generations of optimization, a dimension arrived at through trial and error by craftsmen who built these stoves repeatedly, and learned from each one what worked and what didn't. The structure rose to a height of 6 feet before branching into a chimney, but that height disguised the complexity within. The firebox itself measured only 12 inches wide by 14 inches deep, by 16 inches tall, smaller than the cast-iron stoves, but its walls were lined with fire brick that Volkov shaped and fired himself using clay from the riverbank. He built a small clamp kiln, essentially a dome of clay with a firebox underneath, where he fired approximately 40 bricks over 3 days in October, maintaining temperatures high enough that the clay vitrified, becoming ceramic that could withstand direct flame without degrading. These fire bricks, each measuring roughly 4 inches by 8 inches by 2 inches, lined the firebox in a pattern that left no gaps, creating a refractory chamber that would reflect radiant heat back into the fire, ensuring complete combustion and protecting the structural clay from direct exposure to flame temperatures. Above and around the firebox, Volkov constructed a labyrinth of internal channels, passages that forced hot smoke to travel through the structure's mass before exiting through the chimney. This was the most critical aspect of the design, the feature that distinguished a thermal mass stove from a simple brick box. The channels required precise dimensioning, Too large and the smoke would pass through quickly without surrendering its heat. Too small and the draft would be insufficient, causing smoke to back up into the firebox and potentially into the cabin. Too long and the smoke would cool too much, condensing creosote that would block the passages. Too short and excessive heat would escape up the chimney, wasting fuel. Volkov built the first channel as a rising passage directly above the firebox. A vertical shaft measuring 10 inches wide by 10 inches deep, rising 18 inches before opening into a first chamber, a horizontal space that ran across the width of the stove, approximately 20 inches deep, 14 inches wide, and 16 inches tall. Here, the smoke hit the top surface of the stove and was forced to spread horizontally, contacting a large surface area of clay, beginning the heat transfer process. At the far end of this chamber, the smoke encountered a baffle, a partial wall that forced it downward into a descending channel on the side, a passage measuring 8 inches by 8 inches that dropped 2 feet before opening into a lower chamber. This chamber, positioned roughly at waist height, ran back toward the firebox side of the stove, creating another horizontal heat exchange surface. The smoke then rose again through a second ascending channel, this time on the opposite side from the first descent, climbing into a third chamber near the top of the structure. Finally, the smoke descended one last time before entering the chimney, by which point it had traveled approximately 28 feet, despite the structure's external height of only 6 feet. The smoke's path was not arbitrary. Each rise and fall, each chamber and baffle, served to slow the flow, to create turbulence that improved heat transfer, to maximize contact time between hot gas and cool clay. Volkov created these passages using temporary wooden forms that he carved from pine boards, shaping templates that matched the desired channel dimensions, placing them within the clay structure as he built upward, building the clay walls around them, then carefully removing the forms after the clay had dried enough to hold its shape. The process required patience and timing. Remove the forms too early and the soft clay would slump, closing the passages. Wait too long, and the forms would be locked in place, impossible to remove without breaking the structure. Volkov learned the right timing through practice, through touching the clay surface and judging moisture content by feel, through understanding that clay at just the right stage of drying would release the wooden forms with gentle pulling, but would hold its shape afterward. The exterior surface, once the structure was complete and had dried for 2 weeks, received a final finish layer, a plaster of clay mixed with lime that Volkov obtained by burning river limestone in a pit kiln, creating quicklime that he then slaked with water to produce lime putty. The plaster mixed 3 parts clay to 1 part lime putty, creating a coating approximately 1/4 inch thick that smoothed over the irregular surface, filled small cracks, and created a sealed finish that was white, bright, reflecting light into the cabin while also conducting heat into the room with remarkable gentleness. The white surface served practical and aesthetic purposes. Practically, it allowed visual inspection for cracks or damage. Aesthetically, it transformed the massive structure from a pile of mud into something that looked intentional, finished, almost elegant despite its bulk. He built a sleeping platform on top, accessed by a small ladder constructed from pine branches, creating a space approximately 4 feet by 6 feet, where he and Katerina could sleep directly on the warm surface when winter arrived. The platform's surface would become the warmest part of the stove, reaching temperatures between 80 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the hours after the fire, dropping to perhaps 70 degrees by morning, still warm enough for comfortable sleep, even when the cabin's air temperature dropped to 50 degrees. This elevated sleeping area also utilized the principle of thermal stratification. Warm air rises. The space near the ceiling would be warmer than the space near the floor, creating a natural temperature gradient that the sleeping platform exploited. To his neighbors, particularly Crawford, who watched the construction progress with increasing bewilderment, it looked primitive, inefficient, wasteful of precious cabin space. Crawford calculated that Volkov's structure occupied 42 square feet of floor space, roughly 1/4 of the cabin's total area, compared to his cast iron stove's mere 4 square feet, a tenfold difference in footprint. The logic of efficiency seemed to favor cast iron dramatically. Crawford saw wasted space that could have held furniture, storage, living area. He saw hundreds of hours of labor invested in mixing clay and stacking stones, labor that could have been spent cutting firewood or clearing land. He saw a man working in apparent ignorance of modern methods, stubbornly following obsolete traditions that made no sense in 1890. Other settlers shared similar views. They would mention Volkov at gatherings, shaking their heads, speculating about what would happen when winter came, and he realized his mistake, when he would have to admit defeat and purchase a proper stove like everyone else. Volkov said nothing in response to the skepticism. He didn't attempt to explain or justify or defend his choice. He simply continued working, his hands moving with the confidence of inherited knowledge that no manual could teach. Knowledge passed from grandfather to grandson across generations, knowledge that would soon prove its worth. By late October, the structure was complete. The interior channels had been tested with small test fires to ensure proper draft and smoke flow. The plaster had fully cured, and Volkov was ready for winter. He had invested approximately 120 hours of labor beyond the basic cabin construction, had used approximately 40 wheelbarrow loads of clay, 20 loads of stone, and 12 bundles of straw. The structure weighed approximately 3,000 pounds, represented zero cost in purchased materials beyond the few nails used in the chimney cap, and would burn 1 fire per day, consuming 35 to 40 pounds of wood, maintaining comfortable temperatures for 24 hours. The fire he would light in November would still be warming his cabin in March, not through continuous burning, but through the patient accumulation and release of thermal energy stored in 3,000 pounds of clay and stone, a battery charged daily by fire, a heat reservoir that asked only for patience in return for sustained comfort. The philosophical divide between the two approaches represented fundamentally different understandings of heat and time. The cast iron stove embodied the Industrial Revolution's faith in intensity and speed. Cast iron conducts heat rapidly, with a thermal conductivity of approximately 52 watts per meter Kelvin. This means heat moves through cast iron quickly, radiating into the surrounding air with impressive intensity. When you feed a cast iron stove, you get immediate warmth, a rush of heat that feels like victory over cold. But that same conductivity works in reverse. When the fire dies, heat drains from the cast iron rapidly, flowing out into the cold air, disappearing. Cast iron has relatively low specific heat capacity, approximately 460 joules per kilogram Kelvin, meaning it stores relatively little thermal energy relative to its mass. A 300-pound cast iron stove, heated to high temperature, contains impressive heat, but it releases that heat quickly, within hours. The strategy requires constant feeding, continuous combustion, regular attention. It is a system designed for industrial efficiency, for converting fuel to heat rapidly, but it is not designed for patience or for conservation. The manual's engineers understood metallurgy and combustion, but seem to have forgotten or never learned the older principle of thermal mass. Volkov's stove represented the opposite philosophy. Clay has thermal conductivity of approximately 1.3 watts per meter Kelvin, roughly 40 times lower than cast iron. Heat moves through clay slowly, reluctantly. This seems like a disadvantage until you consider the goal. The goal is not to heat the air immediately, but to store heat in the mass of the structure itself, to create a reservoir of thermal energy that releases slowly, steadily, over many hours. Clay has a specific heat capacity of approximately 880 joules per kilogram Kelvin, nearly twice that of cast iron. 3,000 pounds of clay heated to moderate temperature stores vastly more thermal energy than 300 pounds of cast iron heated to high temperature. The internal channels force hot combustion gases to surrender their heat gradually, ensuring that the thermal energy from the fire transfers into the structure's mass rather than escaping up the chimney. A cast iron stove is a heat converter. A clay mass stove is a heat battery. One delivers intensity. The other delivers duration. In a Siberian winter lasting 5 months, duration matters more than intensity. By late November, enough time had passed for observers to begin taking measurements, even though the true test still lay ahead. Alexander Petrov, a railroad engineer supervising track construction 12 miles north, visited the settlement weekly to inspect worker housing and assess winter preparedness. He carried a mercury thermometer in a wooden case and a notebook, where he recorded observations in careful script. On November 24th, with exterior temperature at -15 degrees Fahrenheit, Petrov visited both Crawford's cabin and Volkov's cabin at different times. At Crawford's cabin, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the cast iron stove burned vigorously with fresh wood. Petrov measured the cabin's interior temperature at 64 degrees Fahrenheit, near the center of the room, 49 degrees in the far corner, and 52 degrees near the sleeping area. The stove's surface temperature, measured with his hand and estimated by timing how long he could maintain contact, exceeded 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Crawford reported burning approximately 130 pounds of wood per day, requiring him to split and stack continuously to maintain adequate supply. At Volkov's cabin, at 4 o'clock the same afternoon, Petrov found Volkov reading a book by the window. The clay stove radiated gentle heat. Petrov measured 61 degrees Fahrenheit in the center of the room, 58 degrees in the far corner, and 65 degrees on the sleeping platform atop the stove. The surface temperature of the stove felt warm to sustained touch, but not hot, perhaps 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Volkov reported burning 1 fire per day, lit in the evening, consuming approximately 35 to 40 pounds of wood, allowed to burn completely to coals over 3 to 4 hours, then left untended until the following evening. Petrov made careful notes. The cabin temperatures were comparable, though Volkov's showed less variation between locations. But the fuel consumption represented a dramatic difference. Crawford burned 3 to 4 times as much wood for similar results. Petrov asked Volkov to explain. Volkov gestured to the stove and spoke about his grandfather, about clay that holds heat like water holds cold, about smoke that must travel long roads before leaving. Petrov understood the explanation imperfectly but recognized its significance. He began visiting both cabins weekly, recording temperatures, fuel consumption, and observations about the settlers' health and capacity for work. Other settlers noticed Petrov's interest and began visiting Volkov's cabin themselves, touching the clay surface, feeling the steady warmth, asking questions in Russian, Polish, Ukrainian, German, each trying to understand how the strange mound in the corner could heat so effectively with so little wood. The interior architecture of Volkov's stove revealed sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics, even though Volkov himself never used such terms. The firebox's relatively small size served a specific purpose. It encouraged complete combustion. A smaller, hotter fire burns more efficiently than a large, cooler fire, extracting more heat from each pound of wood. The fire brick lining protected the clay mass from direct flame, while reflecting radiant heat back into the firebox, ensuring temperatures high enough for complete combustion of the wood gases. Once combustion gases left the firebox, they entered the first chamber, a space approximately 14 inches wide, 20 inches deep, and 16 inches tall, lined with clay. Here, the gases began surrendering heat to the surrounding mass. The temperature dropped from perhaps 1200 degrees Fahrenheit to approximately 800 degrees. The gases then descended through a narrow channel on the side, forced down by the pressure of incoming gases above, entering a lower chamber where they again rose, heating another section of the clay mass, dropping another 200 degrees. This pattern repeated 3 times before the smoke finally entered the chimney, by which point the temperature had dropped to approximately 300 degrees, cool enough that Volkov could hold his hand near the chimney opening without discomfort. A cast iron stove's chimney typically exhausted smoke at 700 to 900 degrees, wasting enormous amounts of thermal energy to the atmosphere. The channel system also created ideal conditions for sustained heat transfer. By forcing the gases to slow down and follow a winding path, the design maximized contact time between hot gas and clay surface, allowing conduction to work effectively despite clay's low thermal conductivity. The total interior surface area of the channels measured approximately 75 square feet, a vast heat exchange surface hidden within the structure's compact external form. The 18-inch wall thickness meant that heat stored in the clay had a long path to travel before reaching the exterior surface. Clay's low thermal conductivity turned this into an advantage. Heat stored in the inner layers diffused slowly outward, creating a sustained release over many hours. The outer surface never became uncomfortably hot, never exceeded 140 degrees Fahrenheit, but it maintained that moderate temperature for 18 to 20 hours after the fire died, radiating gentle warmth into the cabin with the steadiness of sunlight through a window. The sleeping platform on top provided another advantage. Heat rises. The top surface of the stove reached higher temperatures than the sides, creating an ideal sleeping area where body heat combined with radiant heat from below, allowing Volkov's family to sleep comfortably even when cabin temperatures dropped during the night's coldest hours. The test came in January 1891, earlier and more severe than anyone anticipated. On January 9th, a Siberian high-pressure system settled over the region, bringing clear skies, brilliant sunshine that provided light but no warmth, no wind, and temperatures that plunged with startling speed. The temperature on January 8th had been -18 degrees Fahrenheit, cold but manageable, within the range that settlers had experienced throughout December. On the morning of January 9th, the thermometer at the railway camp recorded -32 degrees. By afternoon, -41. By evening, -48. The cold continued deepening. January 10th brought -51 degrees at dawn. January 11th recorded -53 degrees, a temperature so extreme that exposed skin froze within 2 minutes, that breath crystallized in the air like sparkling dust, that metal tools became dangerous to touch with bare hands, that the pine trees in the surrounding forest groaned and cracked from thermal contraction, their sap freezing and expanding, splitting trunks with sounds like rifle shots echoing through the night. The cold maintained this intensity for 11 consecutive days. The sky remained clear, stars visible even at noon when the sun hung low on the southern horizon, providing 6 hours of weak daylight that did nothing to moderate the temperature. The air felt different at -50 degrees than at -20. It felt solid, resistant, as though moving through it required extra effort. It burned in the lungs with each breath. It found every gap in clothing, every unsealed crack in cabin walls, every weakness in construction, and exploited it ruthlessly. Petrov, the railroad engineer, abandoned his routine inspections of track construction, which had ceased anyway as men refused to work in conditions where metal rails could cause instant frostbite. He focused entirely on settler survival, making daily rounds to cabins, checking on families, documenting conditions, measuring temperatures, recording what was rapidly becoming a disaster. His reports, written by lamplight in his quarters at the railway camp, detailed a cascade of failures among the traditional heating systems, failures that followed predictable patterns but varied in their specific manifestations, creating a catalog of cold-weather heating disasters. On January 10th, Crawford's cast-iron stove began developing problems. Despite burning wood continuously, loading the firebox every 3 hours day and night, maintaining flames that Crawford could barely look at directly without eye pain, the cabin's interior temperature dropped to 46 degrees Fahrenheit by morning, measured at center room height. The walls near the stove still radiated some warmth, perhaps 55 degrees, but the far corners of the cabin measured 38 degrees, cold enough that water in a bucket developed a thin skin of ice overnight. The cast iron, superheated by desperate overloading, began to warp. Crawford noticed it first as a change in how the door fit, a gap appearing along the top edge where the door no longer seated, flush against the frame. Then he heard a sharp crack during the night, a metallic sound that woke him from uneasy sleep. In the morning, he found a crack along one seam near the firebox bottom, a hairline split perhaps 4 inches long that leaked smoke into the cabin whenever he loaded wood or adjusted the fire. Smoke leaked into the cabin anyway, even without the crack, whenever wind gusts created backdrafts that overwhelmed the chimney's natural draft. The chimney, following manual specifications at 13 feet high, simply couldn't maintain adequate draft when exterior temperatures dropped so low that the density difference between interior warm air and exterior cold air changed the normal flow patterns. Crawford packed the crack with clay taken from his cabin's chinking material, reinforcing it with twisted wire, but the repair was temporary and inadequate. The stove's efficiency dropped further. The warped door leaked air, creating uncontrolled combustion that wasted wood without producing proportional heat. By January 12th, Crawford was burning 180 pounds of wood per day, splitting and hauling from dawn until after dark, loading the stove every 2.5 hours, and achieving interior temperatures of only 42 degrees. The wood consumption rate meant he was going through 300 pounds every 36 hours, a rate that would exhaust his remaining firewood supply within 17 days, leaving him without heat for the rest of winter. His wife Margaret and their 2 children, aged 6 and 9, spent the days huddled under blankets near the stove, wearing every piece of clothing they owned in layers, their breath visible in the cabin's air, their fingers too cold for any productive work. His hands developed cracks from constant wood splitting, deep fissures in the skin near his knuckles that bled when he flexed his fingers, that refused to heal in the cold, dry air. His sleep came in fragments, never more than 2 hours between wood-loading sessions, leaving him in a state of chronic exhaustion where even simple decisions became difficult. Other settlers faced identical or worse crises. Michael Sokolov, a Ukrainian farmer whose cabin stood 400 yards south of Crawford's, watched his chimney develop ice inside the flue on January 11th. The phenomenon occurred when warm, moist combustion gases from the fire met the extremely cold chimney walls, cooling below the dew point, condensing water vapor that immediately froze into ice. The ice accumulation restricted draft progressively, creating a feedback loop where reduced draft meant cooler combustion, which meant more water vapor in the exhaust, which meant more ice formation. By January 13th, Sokolov's chimney was nearly blocked, smoke backing into his cabin in thick clouds that made breathing difficult, that burned his family's eyes, that forced him to choose between suffocation and freezing. He climbed onto his roof in minus 47-degree temperature, wearing mittens and a scarf wrapped over his mouth, and attempted to clear the chimney with a pole, nearly asphyxiating from the effort and the cold air in his lungs. He got the chimney partially clear, but the ice reformed within 12 hours. The Swedish stove in the cabin belonging to Hermann Brandt, a German merchant who had invested in the premium heating equipment, trusting in European engineering superiority, cracked completely on January 13th, splitting along the firebox bottom in a catastrophic failure. The crack opened perhaps half an inch wide and 8 inches long, caused by thermal stress from continuous high-temperature operation, combined with material fatigue from thermal cycling. Hot ash and coals spilled through the crack onto the brick base, creating a fire hazard that forced Brandt to shut down the stove immediately. He moved his family into his storage shed, a smaller structure built for equipment storage, where he burned furniture in a crude barrel stove he improvised from a grain storage barrel, cutting holes for a door and a stovepipe. The barrel stove performed poorly, unable to maintain even 35 degrees interior temperature, but it was better than nothing. His wife developed frostbite on 3 toes before they realized the danger, her feet going numb inside her boots during the night, tissue freezing without pain, damage that wouldn't fully manifest until the tissue thawed, and she realized the extent of the injury. The railroad camp, which housed 60 workers in 3 long bunkhouses heated by large cast-iron stoves, each stove larger and theoretically more capable than the residential models, saw 4 deaths during those 11 days. 2 deaths came from pneumonia that developed rapidly in men whose immune systems were compromised by cold stress, their bodies unable to maintain normal temperature regulation despite being indoors, their lungs filled with fluid as their bodies tried and failed to compensate. 1 death came from carbon monoxide poisoning when workers, desperate to maintain heat, closed all ventilation openings including the air intake vents, causing incomplete combustion that filled the bunkhouse with odorless, colorless gas. The 4th death was a combination of cold exposure and exhaustion. A worker went outside to the woodshed at 3 in the morning to bring wood for the stove. He slipped on ice, broke his leg, couldn't get back to the bunkhouse, and froze within 40 minutes, despite being only 30 yards from shelter. Petrov recorded everything in his notebook: temperatures, fuel consumption rates, structural failures, health deteriorations, death dates and causes. His handwriting, normally neat and precise, became increasingly hurried and cramped as the crisis deepened, his entries longer and more detailed as he documented what was clearly a slow-motion disaster unfolding across the settlement. He wrote by lamplight after dark, his fingers stiff from cold despite being indoors at the camp's administrative building, which had one of the better heating systems but still struggled to maintain 50 degrees interior temperature. His notebook documented systematic failure of the recommended heating systems when confronted with conditions slightly beyond their design parameters. The stoves worked adequately at -20 degrees. They struggled at -30. They failed catastrophically at -50. The margin between adequate and catastrophic was only 30 degrees, a range that Siberian winters crossed regularly, but that Moscow's winters, where the specifications had been developed, rarely encountered. Then, on January 14th at 20 minutes past midnight, Crawford appeared at Volkov's door. He carried his youngest child, Emma, aged 6, wrapped in blankets. The child was unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular, her body temperature too low for Crawford to estimate. He stood in the doorway, snow crusted on his beard from his breath freezing, his eyes showing the blank exhaustion of someone who has been awake too long, who has made a desperate calculation and acted on it, despite pride, despite embarrassment, despite the implicit admission of failure. His voice cracked when he spoke, asking if they could stay until morning, if Volkov could help, if there was space by the warm stove. Volkov opened the door without hesitation, without questions, without any acknowledgement that this moment represented vindication of his methods. Katerina took the child immediately, unwrapping the blankets, assessing her condition with the practiced efficiency of a schoolteacher who had dealt with children in distress. The child's skin felt cold but not frozen, her pulse weak but present, her body entering hypothermia, but not yet at the stage of irreversible damage. Katerina laid her on the sleeping platform atop the stove, covering her with wool blankets kept there for exactly this purpose, the platform's surface still radiating gentle heat at perhaps 85 degrees, warm enough to raise the child's body temperature gradually without causing thermal shock. Within 20 minutes, Emma began to wake, confused and whimpering. Within an hour, she was conscious and responsive. By dawn, she was sleeping normally. Her body temperature returned to safe levels, her condition stable. Crawford's family remained in Volkov's cabin for 4 days, while Crawford worked desperately to repair his stove and replenish his firewood. During those 4 days, Crawford experienced the clay stove's performance directly. The cabin maintained 63 degrees Fahrenheit consistently, dropping to 58 degrees by morning before Volkov lit the evening fire. The fire itself burned for approximately 3 hours, consuming split birch and pine that Volkov fed gradually into the small firebox, building a bed of coals that glowed orange-red, heating the fire brick to temperatures high enough that Crawford could see the bricks radiating visible heat. After the flames died, and only coals remained, Volkov closed the firebox door and adjusted a damper in the chimney, restricting airflow to prevent cold air from being drawn down through the system. The coals smoldered for another hour, then died completely. But the stove continued heating. At midnight, 6 hours after the fire died, the stove's surface still radiated warmth. At dawn, 12 hours after the fire died, Crawford could still hold his hand against the clay surface and feel heat flowing into his palm. His child recovered. His wife slept through the night without coughing. He asked Volkov detailed questions, examining the structure, tracing the path of the smoke channels, understanding finally that the stove was not really a stove at all, but a thermal storage device, a battery charged once daily by fire and discharged slowly through patient conduction. By January 18th, when temperatures moderated to -30 degrees, and Crawford could return to his own cabin, he had already decided to rebuild his heating system. So had 12 other families. The problem was immediate and practical. They had neither the knowledge nor the time to build structures like Volkov's before the next cold wave arrived. Volkov proposed a solution. His cabin could accommodate more people if they slept in shifts. The sleeping platform on top of the stove could hold 4 adults comfortably, 8 in an emergency. The floor around the stove stayed warm enough for sleeping with adequate blankets. Crawford and 4 other families began coordinating schedules, arriving at Volkov's cabin in the evening, sleeping through the night, returning to their own cabins during the day to work and manage their own diminished fires. Volkov's wife, Katerina, formerly a teacher in Pskov, organized the rotation with strict discipline. Children slept on the platform. Adults slept on floors around the stove. Everyone contributed firewood to the common supply. Everyone helped with cooking, which happened on the stove's top surface, another feature Volkov had designed deliberately. Food preparation became a community activity, with the stove serving simultaneously as heater, sleeping platform, and kitchen. The arrangement continued through February. Volkov burned 40 pounds of wood per day, sometimes 50 when the cabin housed extra people, but never more. The single fire sustained warmth for a cabin housing on average 15 to 18 people during the worst nights. Petrov's February 15th report to the railroad company provided comprehensive statistics that documented the performance gap between the two heating systems. During January and February, Crawford's cabin consumed 4,200 pounds of firewood, maintained average interior temperature of 51 degrees Fahrenheit, experienced 1 stove failure requiring repair, and suffered 1 case of serious illness. Volkov's cabin consumed 2,400 pounds of firewood, maintained average interior temperature of 60 degrees Fahrenheit, experienced no mechanical failures, and reported no serious illness despite housing multiple families periodically. The fuel efficiency difference was not merely incremental, it was categorical. Volkov's system consumed 43% less fuel while delivering superior thermal comfort and reliability. Petrov's report included detailed technical diagrams of Volkov's stove that he had drawn during multiple visits, measuring dimensions with a surveyor's tape, tracing smoke channels by observing draft patterns with burning paper, estimating internal volumes by calculating clay consumption. He estimated the structure contained 3,200 pounds of clay and stone, distributed in walls averaging 17 inches thick, with interior channels totaling approximately 31 linear feet, and exterior radiating surface of approximately 146 square feet. His report concluded with a single recommendation. The Ministry of Internal Affairs should revise the official Homesteader's Manual to include specifications for thermal mass heating systems based on traditional Russian design principles. The report circulated among railroad engineers, mining company supervisors, and timber merchants who supplied the settlements. Orders for cast-iron stoves dropped sharply. Orders for firebrick, clay, and masonry tools increased. 3 local merchants began advertising services for Russian stove construction, though none of them actually knew how to build one. 2 brothers from a village near Volgograd, trained masons who had built traditional stoves for 30 years, saw opportunity and arrived in the region in March, offering construction services for 60 rubles per stove, materials included, completed in 2 weeks. By spring, 17 families had contracted for new stoves. By summer, 43. The knowledge that had seemed primitive and obsolete suddenly became valuable, marketable, essential. The following winter proved less severe than the previous one, but the adoption of thermal mass heating systems continued accelerating. By October 1892, over 120 cabins in the region had been retrofitted with clay stoves based on Volkov's design, with variations introduced by the Mason brothers and other builders who learned the craft. The variations showed understanding developing in real time. Some builders made the structures slightly smaller to save materials and space, reducing mass to 2,000 pounds, though this reduced heating duration to approximately 16 hours instead of 24. Others made them larger, building stoves weighing over 4,000 pounds that could heat for more than 30 hours on a single fire, but required more fuel to charge fully. Some added additional sleeping platforms, creating 2-tier systems. Others incorporated bread ovens into the design, adding chambers for baking that doubled as additional thermal mass. One builder, a Finnish carpenter named Kallio, experimented with hollow chambers filled with sand, hypothesizing that sand might store heat more effectively than solid clay. His experiment failed, the sand acting as insulation rather than storage, but the willingness to experiment showed that the principles were being understood, not merely copied. Crawford, who rebuilt his cabin's heating system in June 1891, became an advocate, explaining to newcomers why thermal mass mattered more than fire intensity, why patience produced better results than urgency. His rebuilt stove, constructed with help from one of the Volgograd masons, weighed 2,800 pounds and heated his cabin for approximately 22 hours on a single fire consuming 45 pounds of wood. His winter fuel consumption dropped from 6 cords to 2 cords, saving him labor, money, and the chronic exhaustion that comes from interrupted sleep. The railroad company, impressed by Petrov's reports and the demonstrated fuel savings, commissioned construction of large thermal mass stoves for 3 worker bunkhouses, each stove weighing over 6,000 pounds and capable of heating spaces housing 40 men. These installations used the same channel principles but scaled up, with fireboxes large enough to burn whole logs, channels tall enough to walk through during construction, and surface areas exceeding 300 square feet. The fuel savings proved even more dramatic at scale. The commercial implications attracted attention beyond the region, with inquiries arriving from mining operations, military outposts, and other railroad construction sites. By 1895, thermal mass heating systems had achieved mainstream legitimacy in Siberian settlements, no longer viewed as primitive or backward, but as sophisticated engineering solutions optimized for extreme cold environments. The official Homesteader's Manual was revised in 1894, adding a 14-page section on clay stove construction with detailed diagrams, materials specifications, and step-by-step instructions. The section opened with an acknowledgement that traditional Russian heating methods, long dismissed by modern engineers as inefficient, actually represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about thermal dynamics in cold climates. The revision represented a quiet admission that engineering expertise without cultural knowledge produces incomplete solutions. Volkov himself never sought credit or compensation for sharing his knowledge. He built stoves for neighbors when asked, charging only for materials, teaching the principles freely to anyone willing to learn. His cabin became an informal school where settlers spent evenings watching him work clay, shape channels, Explain through gesture and broken multilingual fragments why smoke must travel long paths, why mass matters more than speed, why the old ways persisted, because they worked. By the time he died in 1903 at age 47, from injuries sustained in a logging accident unrelated to his heating innovations, over 400 thermal mass stoves operated in the Krasnoyarsk region alone, and the design had spread to settlements along the entire Trans-Siberian route. The Volgograd Mason brothers had trained apprentices who opened their own businesses, spreading across Siberia like seeds carried by wind. The knowledge moved through communities organically, carried by people who had experienced both systems and understood viscerally the difference between heat that lasts and heat that vanishes. The story of Ivan Volkov and his clay stove might seem like a minor footnote in the history of Siberian settlement, a small technical detail in a much larger narrative of expansion and development. But it illuminates a principle that transcends heating systems and applies to any challenge involving resource limitation and environmental stress. The principle is this: efficiency is not always about doing more with more intensity, but often about doing less with better design. The cast iron stoves failed not because they were poorly made, but because they were optimized for the wrong metric. They converted wood to heat rapidly, which seems efficient until you realize that rapid conversion without storage merely wastes fuel. They prioritized intensity over duration, speed over patience, immediate sensation over sustained comfort. They embodied industrial thinking applied to a problem that required agricultural thinking, the thinking of people who understand seasons, cycles, accumulation, and release. Volkov's stove succeeded because it stored energy rather than merely converting it, because it worked with time rather than against it, because it recognized that in a 5-month winter, the goal is not to generate heat quickly, but to retain it slowly. The 3,000 pounds of clay was not dead weight or wasted space. It was the essential component, the thermal battery that made the entire system functional. Without the mass, the fire would have been as wasteful as any cast iron stove. With the mass, the fire became a daily charging cycle for a heating system that operated continuously, patiently, reliably. The lesson applies beyond heating. Any system facing resource constraints benefits from storage and patience. Any system facing sustained stress benefits from thermal mass, from reserves that buffer against variability, from designs that prioritize duration over intensity. The modern world still forgets this lesson regularly, building systems that work spectacularly for short periods and fail under sustained load, that require constant feeding and attention, rather than patient accumulation and release. Volkov's clay stove, built in a Siberian cabin in 1890 using principles older than written history, remains a reminder that sometimes the most sophisticated engineering looks primitive until you understand what problem it actually solves.